I'm a park ranger. When the animals run, we run too. Part 2. I told myself it was a coincidence. That's what you do when something impossible happens 240 miles from the place where the impossible was supposed to stay. You tell yourself the nosebleed was dry air. The silence was a power fluctuation, some transformer blowing on the grid, killing the hum of every appliance in the house for 9 minutes. You tell yourself these things, because the alternative is that the thing you spent 11 years running from has been underneath you the entire time, and didn't need to chase you at all. I told myself that for about 6 hours. Then I drove to the veterinary clinic on the east side of Bend. I know that sounds strange. A vet clinic. But I'd been thinking about the animals. I'd never stopped thinking about the animals, and there was something I needed to check. A woman named Dr. Rena Okafor ran a small practice near the Deschutes River that handled mostly large animals, horses and cattle from the ranches east of town. I'd met her the previous spring at a community wildfire preparedness meeting. We'd talked about wildlife behavior during evacuations, and she'd mentioned something that had stayed with me. She said the ranchers had been reporting unusual livestock behavior for the past 2 years, cattle refusing to graze in certain pastures, horses becoming agitated at night for no apparent reason, dogs howling at specific times, then going silent. At the time, I'd nodded politely and filed it away as ranch country folklore. Now I was sitting in her waiting room at 8 a.m. with circles under my eyes and dried blood on my upper lip. Rena came out between appointments. She was a tall woman, early 50s, with the kind of direct gaze that comes from spending decades looking at animals and knowing when something is wrong before the owner does. She recognized me and smiled, but the smile faded when she got a better look at my face. "Darren, you look terrible." "Thanks. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The livestock behavior you told me about last spring. The cattle that wouldn't graze. Is that still happening?" Her expression changed. Not suspicion. Interest. "Why?" "I'm working on something. Personal research. I need to know if the behavior patterns are still occurring and whether they've changed." She studied me for a moment, then gestured toward her office. We sat down across from each other, separated by a desk covered in charts and invoices. "It's gotten worse," she said. "I didn't talk about it at the meeting because I didn't want to alarm anyone, but I've been tracking it informally for about 18 months. It started with the Hendricks Ranch, about 12 miles east of town. Their cattle began avoiding a pasture on the north end of the property. Just wouldn't go in. They'd cluster along the fence line and refuse to cross. The Hendricks thought it was a predator, so they called Fish and Wildlife. No evidence of predator activity. When did it start? Spring 2024, around March. I did the math. That was about 1.5 years ago. But the expansion rate Whitfield had quoted was 100 meters per year. Even if the network had been growing continuously since 2014, it should have covered maybe 1 kilometer past its original boundary. Cascade River was 240 miles from Bend. The numbers didn't work, unless the expansion rate had changed, or unless the network was bigger than anyone realized. "Has the affected area grown?" I asked. Rena pulled a folder from her desk and opened it. Inside were hand-drawn maps of ranch properties with areas shaded in colored pencil. The Hendricks pasture was the first. Then, in the summer of 2024, 2 more ranches reported similar behavior: the Dominguez Place, about 8 miles south of Hendricks, and the Paulson Spread, which is 14 miles northwest. Different directions, different elevations. No obvious connecting factor. "Soil type?" She looked at me oddly. "I'm a veterinarian, not a geologist." "But now that you mention it, one of the ranchers, Jim Paulson, told me something interesting. He said the grass in the affected pasture looked different. Not dead, just off. He said it was greener than it should have been for the season, like it was growing faster than the surrounding grass. And when he pulled some up, the root system was unusually dense, matted. He said it felt like pulling up carpet. Dense root systems, faster growth. Mycorrhizal networks boost plant growth by facilitating nutrient transfer. That's basic ecology. If the network was present in the soil beneath those pastures, the vegetation above it would show exactly those characteristics. Raina, did any of the ranchers report health effects? Headaches, nosebleeds, ear ringing, anything like that? She closed the folder slowly. Why are you asking me that? Please. Jim Paulson had a nosebleed in June 2024, out in the north pasture. He went to urgent care and they told him it was the heat. His wife Margaret started getting migraines around the same time. She'd never had migraines before. And the animals? Any unexplained deaths? Rena was quiet for a long time. Then she opened a different drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. In the last 14 months, I've performed necropsies on 11 animals, from ranches in the Greater Bend area. 6 cattle, 3 horses, 2 dogs. All died of apparent cardiac arrest. All were previously healthy. None had pre-existing conditions that would explain sudden cardiac failure. She opened the folder and turned it toward me. I sent blood work to Oregon State. Every single animal had cortisol levels consistent with extreme, prolonged terror. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the desk. I've been trying to get someone to pay attention to this for months, Raina said. I contacted the state veterinarian. I contacted OSU's veterinary diagnostic lab. I contacted the county health department. Everyone tells me it's probably environmental, maybe a toxin in the groundwater, maybe algal blooms in the irrigation system. Nobody's tested for anything, and nobody seems particularly motivated to start. Have you contacted the Forest Service? Why would I contact the Forest Service? These are ranch animals on private land miles from any national forest. I sat there and thought about what to say. I thought about the confidentiality requirements Whitfield had imposed. I thought about the career I no longer had and the security clearance I never wanted. I thought about Cal Everett dying of cardiac arrest in 2019. Perfectly healthy. Rena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. I told her. Not everything, not the names, not the specific locations, not the classified details of the containment operation. But I told her about the mycorrhizal network, the expansion, the animal deaths at Cascade River, the cortisol levels, the infrasonic vibrations, the cardiac arrest in healthy organisms. I told her that what she was seeing in Bend might not be a local phenomenon. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for about 30 seconds. You're telling me there's a fungal network underground that can kill animals with fear? I'm telling you that's what I observed, and what I was told by people who studied it. And you think this network has reached Bend, Oregon, 240 miles from where it was originally documented. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Darren, mycorrhizal networks don't expand at that rate. The fastest growing networks add maybe a few meters per year under ideal conditions. What you're describing would require growth rates that are orders of magnitude beyond anything in the literature. I know. So either the growth rate is much faster than anyone estimated, or the network was always larger than anyone realized. That second possibility hadn't fully formed in my mind until she said it. But once she said it, it settled into place with a weight that felt like certainty. The network at Cascade River wasn't expanding outward from a central point. It was already everywhere. It had always been everywhere. What was expanding was not the network itself, but something else: its activity, its awareness, its capacity to affect the surface world. The old growth section wasn't the organism, and it was just where the organism was closest to the surface, where the ancient trees had maintained a stable enough ecosystem for the network to achieve whatever threshold Price had detected. The containment operation hadn't been containing a perimeter. It had been suppressing activation along a boundary that was meaningless to something that existed beneath the entire landscape. Whitfield had been building a fence around a puddle while standing on an ocean. I left Rena's office with her phone number and a promise to share information. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station and used the prepaid phone, a new one, purchased after the Cascade River phone went dead, to call a number I'd been carrying in my wallet for 11 years. Doug Patillo's number. It rang 4 times. A woman answered. "Hello? I'm looking for Doug Patillo. My name is Darren Voss. I'm a retired ranger." A pause. "Doug passed away last year." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry. May I ask how?" "It was his heart. He went in his sleep. The doctor said it was probably an arrhythmia." I thanked her and hung up. Doug Patillo, Cal Everett, Mark Solano, all cardiac events. All people who had been close to the old growth section, close to the network, exposed to whatever it emitted, and all dead years after their exposure, hundreds of miles apart. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and thought about the nosebleed. My nosebleed, in Bend, Oregon, at 2:17 in the morning. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I was already dying and just didn't know it yet. I made a doctor's appointment for the following week. A full physical. Blood work, cardiac screening, the whole battery. Then I spent 3 days doing something I should have done years earlier. I researched mycorrhizal networks, not the popular science version, the Wood Wide Web, the friendly articles about trees talking to each other, the actual research. I read papers from the University of British Columbia, from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, from labs in Germany and Japan and Australia. I read about Suzanne Simard's work on mother trees and resource sharing. I read about the electrical signals mycorrhizal fungi transmit, action potentials, similar to what neurons fire. I read about networks spanning hundreds of acres that could transmit chemical warnings from one tree to another in a matter of hours. Then I found a paper that stopped me. It was published in 2019 in a journal called Fungal Ecology by a team at the University of Exeter. The paper described an experiment in which researchers applied electrical stimulation to a mycorrhizal network in a controlled laboratory setting and measured the network's response. What they found was that the network didn't just transmit the signal passively, the way a wire conducts electricity. It processed the signal. The network modified the frequency, amplitude, and timing of the electrical impulse as it traveled, in patterns that resembled the paper's word: computation. The fungal network was not just a communication system. It was, in a limited but measurable sense, thinking. The paper was cautious, measured, full of qualifiers. But the data was clear. Mycorrhizal networks exhibited information processing behavior that was functionally analogous to neural networks. Not identical, not conscious in any way the researchers were willing to claim, but computational. I read the paper 3 times. Then I searched for Dr. Alan Price's publication history again, looking at the years before he came to Cascade River. His early work in the late 90s focused on mycorrhizal network mapping, measuring the physical extent of networks in old-growth forests using DNA analysis and isotope tracing, standard ecology. But his last published paper from 2004 was different. It was titled Anomalous Electrochemical Activity in Ancient Mycorrhizal Systems, Preliminary Observations, published in a small journal I'd never heard of, 6 pages, no co-authors. The abstract described electrical measurements taken from a mycorrhizal network in an unnamed Pacific Northwest old-growth forest. The measurements showed coordinated electrical activity across the entire network, not the random, localized firing that previous studies had documented, but synchronized pulses that propagated across thousands of meters in patterns that repeated at regular intervals. Price compared these patterns to EEG readings brainwaves. He was careful to note that this was an analogy, not a diagnosis. But the data he presented showed something unmistakable. The network was oscillating, like a brain during sleep. Regular, rhythmic, coordinated activity across its entire structure. The paper's final sentence read, "Further investigation is warranted to determine whether these oscillatory patterns represent an emergent property of network scale, or evidence of a previously unrecognized capacity for integrated electrochemical processing in ancient fungal systems. That was Price's last publication. The study at Cascade River began the following year. Whatever he found when he went deeper, when he installed those subterranean sensor arrays and pushed instruments directly into the network, it never made it into a journal. It made it into a classified file, and a DoD contract and a containment operation that had been running for over a decade. I thought about Elena's words. Like a brain. I thought about the bare soil patches in the old growth section, warm to the touch, the mycelium pulsing rhythmically. Nodes, like neurons, concentrated processing centers in a network that spanned how far? 12,000 acres, 12,000 square miles, the entire Pacific Northwest. I thought about the deer standing in open forest, dying of terror without moving, not because something attacked them, not because something chased them, because something noticed them. And I thought about the elk. 30 animals, all turning at the same instant, all running in the same direction. Not because they heard a sound or smelled a predator, because they felt the attention shift toward them, and they did the only thing evolution had taught them to do. They ran. Animals don't investigate. Animals don't stand there wondering what the feeling is, where it's coming from, whether it can be explained. Animals feel danger and they move, instantly, completely, without hesitation or doubt. Humans are the ones who stay. My medical results came back the following week. The cardiac screening showed nothing abnormal. My blood work was clean. But there was one flag: my cortisol levels were elevated. Not dramatically, not dangerously, just higher than expected for a healthy 57-year-old man with no acute stressors. The doctor attributed it to poor sleep and recommended I try meditation. I didn't tell her about the nosebleed. I didn't tell her about the silence at 2:17 a.m. I didn't tell her that I was a data point in a pattern that stretched back over 20 years and covered hundreds of miles. Instead, I went home and started making a map. I used a large piece of butcher paper taped to my dining room table. I plotted every data point I had. The Cascade River Old Growth section. The boundary events from 2006, 2009, 2014. The ranches outside Bend where Raina had documented animal deaths. The location of my house. Doug Patillo's home in Oregon. Cal Everett's last known address. Mark Solano's place of death, which I looked up in an old obituary, Portland, Oregon. Every point fell within the Pacific Northwest. Every point was in Oregon or Washington. And when I drew rough circles around the areas where events had been documented, the circles overlapped along a north-south axis that followed the Cascade Range. The Cascades. The volcanic mountain chain running from Northern California to British Columbia. Millions of acres of forest, temperate rainforest, old-growth managed timber, wilderness. Underneath all of it, an unbroken geological substrate of volcanic soil, the richest growing medium on the continent. Perfect conditions for mycorrhizal networks. Networks that could be thousands of years old, interconnected across hundreds of miles through root systems and soil horizons and underground water channels. I stared at the map and felt very small. The phone rang at 9 p.m. Not the prepaid, my landline. Mr. Voss? I didn't recognize the voice. Female, middle-aged, professional. Who is this? My name is Dr. Nina Reeves. I'm a research physician with OHSU Oregon Health and Science University. I'm calling because your name appeared in a dataset I've been compiling, and I'm hoping you might be willing to speak with me. What dataset? I'm studying a cluster of unexplained cardiac events in the Pacific Northwest. Deaths and near-death episodes with no clear etiology. Your name came up in connection with a Freedom of Information Act request I filed regarding federal employees who served in certain national forest districts. Which districts? I'd rather discuss that in person if you're willing. I'm based in Portland, but I can drive to Bend. I should have said no. Every rational instinct told me to say no. The last time a researcher had walked into my life offering information, She'd disappeared without a trace. But there was something in Nina Reeves's voice that I recognized, the sound of someone who had been chasing an answer for a long time and was running out of places to look. "When?" I said. "Tomorrow, if possible." She arrived at my house the next afternoon. She was about 50, compact, with graying hair cut short and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a decade of hospital corridors. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, the butcher paper map still spread out between us. She saw the map immediately. Her eyes widened. "You've been tracking it," she said. "Tracking what exactly?" She set the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside were folders, dozens of them tabbed and color-coded. She pulled out one and opened it. In the last 8 years, there have been 43 unexplained cardiac deaths in Oregon and Washington that match a specific profile. All victims were between 26 and 68 years old. All were previously healthy. All died of sudden cardiac arrest with no underlying pathology. Post-mortem blood work, when available, showed markedly elevated cortisol and adrenaline, consistent with extreme sympathetic nervous system activation. She spread the folders across the table. "I started looking into this because 3 of the deaths occurred at OHSU patients who came in for unrelated issues and died on the floor during the night. Same time window, between 1 and 4 a.m. Same blood work profile. I thought it might be a drug interaction or a contamination issue. It wasn't." "What was it?" "I don't know, but when I expanded my search to the state medical examiner's database, I found the rest. 43 deaths over 8 years scattered across both states. No common demographic, no common medication, no common exposure except geography. Every single death occurred within a specific region." She pulled out a map of her own. It was printed, with red dots marking each death. The dots traced the Cascade Range from southern Oregon to the Canadian border. I looked at her map. I looked at mine. The patterns overlaid almost perfectly. "You know about the network," I said. "I know something is killing people along the Cascades and nobody is investigating it. I don't know what the network is. That's why I'm here." She looked at me steadily. "Your name came up in a FOIA response from the Forest Service. You were listed as the reporting officer for a series of wildlife mortality events at Cascade River National Forest in 2014. The response was heavily redacted, but your name wasn't. I've been trying to reach you for 3 months. 3 months. I sent letters. You didn't respond." I hadn't received any letters. I thought about Brian Whitfield, about the filing cabinet in my station, about the padlock on the gate. I thought about the mail that arrived at my house in Bend, sorted and delivered by a postal system that anyone with a federal badge could access. "I never got them," I said. Nina looked at me for a long moment. "That's what I was afraid of." I told her the story. All of it this time. Not the abbreviated version I'd given Rena. The whole thing: Cascade River, the dead deer, the old growth section, Price's study, the sensor arrays, the DOD contract, Whitfield, the containment operation, Cal, Doug, Elena, the nosebleeds, the vibrations, the silence. I talked for over 2 hours. She took notes in a small, tight hand that reminded me of Elena's handwriting in the diner in Harmon, and a cold feeling passed through me that I pushed aside. When I finished, she sat back and removed her glasses. "Darren, I need to show you something." She pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before, thicker than the others, with a red tab. 6 months ago, I obtained a partial copy of a document through a secondary FOIA request. Not from the Forest Service, but from the Department of Energy. Energy, not defense. The program appears to have been transferred between agencies at least twice. It started under a DOD subcontract, as you described. In 2008, oversight was moved to the Department of Energy. In 2016, it was moved again to an interagency task force that doesn't appear in any public organizational chart. She opened the folder. The document inside was heavily redacted, thick black bars covering most of the text, but the header was partially visible. Subsurface Integrated Network Monitoring Program Annual Status Review, 2021. This is the containment operation, I said. This is what's left of it after the redactions. Most of the operational details are blacked out, but there are fragments. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the third page, where a few sentences had survived the censor's marker. I read them aloud. Network Coherence Index has increased by a factor of 4.7 since baseline measurements in 2003. Expansion of detectable electrochemical activity now encompasses an estimated, redacted, square kilometers. Current suppression infrastructure is operating at, redacted, percent capacity. A recommendation: immediate expansion of perimeter array to accommodate projected growth through 2030. Note: suppression does not inhibit network growth. Suppression reduces surface-level manifestation only. The network continues to expand beneath the suppression boundary at redacted bar rate. I read the last sentence again. Suppression does not inhibit network growth. Suppression reduces surface-level manifestation only. The containment wasn't containing anything. It was just making the symptoms quieter. The network was still growing beneath it, expanding through the soil, the rock, the deep substrate, moving through underground channels and root systems and aquifers that no surface-level sensor array could reach. The perimeter was a band-aid on a wound that went all the way down. "There's more," Nina said. She turned to the last page. Another surviving fragment. Physiological effects on surface organisms, consistent with previous observations. Cardiac events in fauna continue to correlate with periods of elevated network activity. Human exposure protocols updated to require minimum, redacted, meters distance from active nodes during peak cycles. Note: 2 personnel experience symptoms consistent with acute exposure during routine maintenance of Station 7 perimeter array on redacted. Both recovered. Recommend medical monitoring for all field personnel for a minimum of redacted years following last exposure. Medical monitoring, I said. For how many years? It's redacted. But the implication is clear. Exposure to this thing has long-term health consequences, and the people who are monitoring it know that. I thought about Cal, about Doug, about Mark Solano, about the nosebleed in my kitchen at 2:17 a.m. Nina, do you have death records for any of the containment field personnel? I've been trying. The personnel records are completely sealed. I can't even get names. But I did find something else. She pulled out one more document, a single page, a photocopy of what appeared to be a handwritten note on lined paper. The handwriting was cramped, unsteady, written by someone in a hurry or under stress. This was included in the FOIA response by what I believe was an error. It wasn't part of the official document. It was stuck to the back of one of the redacted pages. Someone at the DOE records office either didn't notice it or didn't realize what it was. I read the note. The suppression array is failing at stations 3, 7, and 12. Replacement parts have been on back order for 9 months. We've lost 40% of the northern perimeter coverage since January. I've reported this to Whitfield 4 times. No response. Last week, the crew at Station 7 recorded a coherence spike that exceeded anything in the dataset, 11.4 on the integration index, which is triple the previous maximum. The pulse was sustained for 47 minutes. 3 of the 4 crew members experienced nosebleeds. 1 experienced a temporary hearing loss. Wildlife mortality in the surrounding sector increased by 600% in the following 48 hours. I am requesting emergency authorization to evacuate all field personnel from the northern perimeter. I am also requesting that the scope of this program be escalated to the director level. I do not believe we are monitoring a passive phenomenon. The coherence spike on the 14th was not random. It was directional. The pulse was aimed at Station 7, at the crew. It knows we're here. It has always known we're here. And I believe it is testing our perimeter the way an animal tests a fence. RK, Station 7. Lead March 14th, 2022. I set the note down. My hands were shaking. RK, I said. I don't know who that is. Neither do I, but whoever they are, they were stationed at the same location referenced in the program status review. Station 7, on the northern perimeter of the containment area. Sector 7, I said. That was my sector. When I was at Cascade River, Station 7 would have been right on the boundary where I found the dead deer, where I watched the elk run. The note is dated 2022, 8 years after your departure. The coherence spike it describes, 11.4 on whatever scale they're using, was triple the previous maximum. Whatever this thing was doing in 2014 when you were there, by 2022, it was doing it 3 times harder. And the suppression array was failing. 40% of the northern perimeter, with no replacement parts, and no response from Whitfield. I stood up and walked to the window. My backyard in Bend, ponderosa pines, juniper, volcanic soil. I'd moved here because it was dry, because it was different from the wet, dense, ancient forests of the Cascade River District, because I thought dry meant safe. But the Cascades were right there. I could see them from my living room window, the snow-capped peaks along the horizon, beautiful and constant. And beneath them, beneath the mountains and the valleys and the cities and the ranches, the network was growing, spreading, waking up. Nina, what do you think is happening? She came and stood beside me at the window. I think the Pacific Northwest is sitting on top of the largest living organism on Earth, and it's been here for thousands of years, and it's been dormant or low-level or whatever you want to call it for most of that time. I think Price's instruments did something to it, stimulated it, activated it, woke it up, and I think it's been getting more active ever since, not because it's growing, because it's already grown. What's changing is its behavior, the coherence, the coordination, the integration. The thing is consolidating, becoming more unified, more aware. She turned to look at me, and I think the cardiac deaths are a side effect. The network's electrical activity interferes with the mammalian nervous system. At low levels, you get stress responses, elevated cortisol, anxiety, nosebleeds. At higher levels, the sympathetic nervous system overloads. The heart can't take the signal. Like capture myopathy, the way Marcy Tillman described it. Exactly. Except there's no cage. The organism that's causing the stress response is invisible, underground everywhere. The animals can't see it, but they can feel it. They sense the electrical field, and they do the only thing they can. They run. They run. Because at some point in their evolutionary history, animals learned that when the ground feels wrong, you leave. That instinct is millions of years old. It predates every other fear response. It's deeper than the fear of predators, deeper than the fear of fire or flood. It's the most primitive alarm system in the animal kingdom. And humans don't have it. Humans have it. We just don't listen to it. We override it with rationality, with curiosity, with the need to understand. The deer doesn't ask why the ground feels wrong, it just goes. We stand there and take measurements. I thought about the title of Price's last paper, Anomalous Electrochemical Activity, Preliminary Observations. The language of a man who stood in the presence of something vast and ancient and tried to understand it instead of running. I thought about Mark Solano, who went into the core zone without shielding during a peak activity period, who stayed to gather data instead of leaving. I thought about Cal, who stayed in his tower for 18 years, watching lights move through the forest at night. I thought about myself, who found dead deer and missing cameras and changed locks and spent weeks pushing deeper instead of walking away. Who cut through a gate with bolt cutters and hiked into the heart of it because I needed to know. The animals ran. Every time. Instantly and completely and without hesitation. We stayed. Every time. To investigate. To understand. To document. And then we died. Nina stayed for 3 hours. We combined our data, her cardiac death clusters, my timeline of events, the containment documents, the ranch animal deaths Rena had recorded. The pattern was clear, and it was accelerating. The 43 unexplained cardiac deaths in her dataset were distributed across 8 years, but they weren't distributed evenly. There were 2 deaths in 2017, 3 in 2018, 4 in 2019, 6 in 2020, 7 in 2021, 8 in 2022, 7 in 2023, and 6 in the first 10 months of 2024. But the geographic spread was expanding. The earliest deaths were all within 50 miles of the Cascade Range. By 2023, they were occurring as far as Portland to the west and Bend to the east. The network's effects were reaching further from the mountains, or the mountains had never been the boundary at all. Before Nina left, she gave me a piece of equipment, a small battery-powered sensor about the size of a deck of cards. She called it an ELF detector, extremely low frequency. It measured electromagnetic emissions below 300 Hz, the range where the network's activity would register. I've been placing these in locations where cardiac events have occurred, she said. Most of the time they register nothing, normal background electromagnetic noise, but occasionally, usually between 1 and 4 a.m., they spike. Brief pulses of coherent low-frequency emission, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to an hour. How often? Increasingly often. The intervals between spikes are getting shorter. She told me to place the detector in my house and monitor it. She gave me a small notebook and asked me to record any readings, any symptoms, and any animal behavior I observed. Then she got in her car and drove back to Portland. I placed the ELF detector on my kitchen counter and watched it for the rest of the evening. The display showed a flat line hovering around 0.3 milligauss normal background. It stayed flat through dinner, through the evening news, through the book I tried to read and couldn't concentrate on. At 11 p.m. I went to bed. At 2:17 a.m. I woke up. The silence was back. Total, absolute wrong. I lay in bed and listened to nothing. No furnace, no refrigerator, no wind, nothing. I got up and walked to the kitchen. The ELF detector's display was no longer flat. It showed a spike, a clean, sharp waveform, oscillating at a frequency the device displayed as 7.83 Hz. The Schumann resonance. The fundamental frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic field. Except the amplitude was wrong. The signal was 40 times stronger than the natural background, and it was pulsing. Not randomly. In a rhythm. About once every 4 seconds. Like breathing. I stood in my kitchen in Bend, Oregon, 240 miles from Cascade River, and watched an instrument confirm what my body had already told me. The network was here, beneath my house, beneath my street, beneath the city. It had been here for years, maybe decades, maybe centuries, growing silently through the volcanic soil, connecting to the vast mycorrhizal systems of every forest in the Cascades. And now, it was waking up. Not just at Cascade River, everywhere. The reading persisted for 12 minutes. Then it faded, the signal dropping back to baseline. The silence lifted. The furnace kicked on. The refrigerator hummed. The world returned to normal. My nose was bleeding again. I wiped it with the back of my hand and looked at the dark window above the sink. My reflection stared back at me, a 57-year-old man in a dark kitchen with blood on his lip and fear in his eyes. But behind my reflection, in the backyard, I saw something that made everything else irrelevant. The deer. 5 mule deer, standing in my backyard, motionless, all facing the same direction. North, toward the Cascades. They were rigid, locked in place. The same posture I'd seen in the elk 11 years ago. Heads up, bodies still. listening to something I could no longer hear but that my detector had just recorded. I watched them for about 30 seconds. Then, simultaneously, they broke. All 5 of them at the same instant, sprinting south, away from the mountains, away from whatever had just pulsed through the ground beneath us. They jumped my fence and disappeared into the dark. I stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the empty yard. The animals knew. They always knew. And they always ran. I should have run too. I didn't. I stayed. Because I'm human, and humans stay. The next morning I called Rena Okafor and told her about the ELF readings. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something I need to show you. Can you come to the Paulson Ranch?" I drove out to the Paulson place that afternoon. It was a cattle operation about 14 miles northwest of Bend, backed up against a stretch of BLM land that climbed toward the foothills. Jim Paulson was a lean, weathered man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent his entire life outdoors. His wife Margaret met us at the door. She was holding the side of her head. "Migraine?" Rena asked. Margaret nodded. "Worst one yet. Started about 2 this morning." 2 a.m., the same window. Jim took us out to the north pasture. It was a 30-acre field bordered by juniper on 3 sides, with a view of the mountains to the north. The cattle were clustered in the south end of the pasture, pressed against the fence line. None of them were grazing. They stood in a tight group, facing south, not moving. "They've been like that for 3 days," Jim said. "Won't go north of the creek. I've tried herding them. They won't move. I've been ranching for 40 years, and I've never seen cattle behave like this." We walked north across the pasture. About 200 yards in, I felt a subtle change in the air, a heaviness, like the atmospheric pressure had increased by a few millibars. My ears popped. Rena rubbed the back of her neck. "There," Jim said, pointing. The grass on the north side of the creek was different, not subtly different, dramatically different. It was a deep, vivid green, thick and lush, growing in a dense mat that looked almost tropical. In late October, when the surrounding grass was brown and dormant, this section was growing like it was June. But it wasn't just the grass. The juniper trees at the edge of the pasture were changing. Their normally sparse, twisted branches were putting out new growth, dense clusters of bright green needles that looked wrong, too uniform, too symmetrical. The trees looked healthy in a way that was somehow unhealthy, like they were growing too well. Rena crouched at the edge of the green zone and pulled up a handful of grass. The root system came up in a thick, tangled mat, and beneath the roots, visible against the dark soil, was a web of white filament so dense it looked like fabric. "Mycelium," she said. "I've never seen surface-level growth this dense outside of a laboratory." I crouched beside her. The soil was warm. Not dramatically, maybe 5 degrees above the surrounding ground, but measurably, unmistakably warm. "This is a node," I said, "like the ones I found in the old growth section, a concentration point in the network." Jim was standing a few yards back, watching us with an expression I recognized. The expression of a man who knows something is wrong with his land, but doesn't want to know what it is. "What are you saying?" he asked. "Something's growing under my pasture." "Jim, has anyone from the government contacted you about this? Anyone at all? Forest Service, BLM, anyone?" "No, should they have?" I looked at Rena. She looked at me. We were both thinking the same thing. The containment operation, if it still existed, had not expanded to cover new areas of network activity. Either they didn't know the network had reached this far, or they knew and were choosing not to act. Or they couldn't act. Because the note from Station 7 had said the suppression array was failing, and Whitfield wasn't responding, and the perimeter was collapsing. If the containment infrastructure was designed for a 12,000-acre reserve in one national forest, there was no way to scale it to cover an area spanning 2 states. The fence was down, and whatever it had been holding had been free for years. I placed one of Nina's ELF detectors at the Paulson Ranch before we left. Jim looked at it skeptically but didn't object. Margaret watched from the porch, still holding her head. That evening, I called Nina and told her about the ranch. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "I got a call today from a colleague at the University of Washington. He's a seismologist. He said something strange has been showing up in his data for the past few years, low-frequency vibrations that don't match any known geological source, too regular to be tectonic, too deep to be traffic or industrial noise. He's been dismissing them as instrument artifacts, but they've been getting stronger." "What frequency?" "Around 8 Hertz. The same as your kitchen reading." "Nina, that's the Schumann resonance frequency." "I know, but the amplitude is orders of magnitude above normal, and the signal is coming from underground, not from the atmosphere, where the Schumann resonance originates. From the Earth itself." The network was oscillating at the Earth's own resonant frequency, matching it, synchronizing with it. Like a voice harmonizing with a note until the two become indistinguishable. Over the next 2 weeks, events accelerated in a way that made my careful documentation feel like trying to catalog a landslide, one pebble at a time. The ELF detector at the Paulson Ranch recorded spikes on 9 out of 14 nights. The spikes were increasing in duration and amplitude. Jim Paulson lost 2 more cattle, both found dead in the green zone of the north pasture, same posture as the deer I'd found at Cascade River. Margaret Paulson's migraines became daily. Jim started sleeping in the barn because Margaret couldn't tolerate the low vibration that hummed through the house between 1 and 3 a.m. Rena documented similar reports from 2 more ranches and a residential neighborhood on the north side of Bend. Pets behaving erratically, birds absent from certain areas for hours at a time. A homeowner who found a patch of unusually green grass in her backyard that was warm to the touch. Nina's seismologist colleague at UW published a preliminary note about the anomalous low-frequency vibrations, framing it as a curiosity, a puzzle for further investigation. Within a week, the note was removed from the university's preprint server. No explanation was given. When Nina called the colleague to ask why, he said the university's legal department had advised him to withdraw the paper pending review. He sounded shaken. He said someone from a federal agency. He wouldn't say which one had visited his office. The pattern was familiar. Inquire, discover, be redirected, be silenced. The same pattern I'd encountered at Cascade River, the same pattern Elena had described, the same pattern that had been operating for 20 years. Except now it was happening at a university in Seattle, not a ranger station in the Cascades. The suppression wasn't just ecological, it was informational. Someone Whitfield's people, or their successors, was still actively preventing the phenomenon from becoming public knowledge. But they were losing control. The events were too widespread now, affecting too many people in too many places. You can classify a research study. You can redact a government report. You can reassign a ranger or buy off a seasonal employee. But you can't classify migraines in a residential neighborhood. You can't redact dead cattle. You can't reassign an entire city. On November 18th, I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the silence. It had become almost routine, the nightly pulse, the nosebleed, the deer in the yard. I got up, checked the ELF detector, noted the spike, wiped my nose, and went back to bed. I was adapting to it, getting used to it. The way you get used to living near a train track and eventually stop hearing the trains. That terrified me more than anything else, because the animals never adapted. The elk never stopped running. The deer never got used to it. Every pulse, every spike, every wave of attention from the network below, the animals responded with the same primal, absolute urgency. They didn't habituate. They didn't normalize. They ran, every single time, because whatever they were sensing was genuinely dangerous, every single time. I was habituating. getting comfortable, staying. On November 20th, something happened that broke the routine. I was at the grocery store in Bend, middle of the afternoon, pushing a cart through the produce section. Normal as it gets. The store was busy families, retirees, a couple of college kids debating pasta brands, music playing over the speakers, fluorescent lights buzzing. Then the music stopped. Not gradually, not a fade out. It cut off mid-note, replaced by a low hum that I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. The fluorescent lights flickered. Every person in the store paused. I watched a woman near the bananas stop mid-reach, her hand frozen in the air, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something she couldn't identify. The hum lasted about 3 seconds. Then it was gone. The music came back. The lights stabilized. People resumed shopping. The woman picked up her bananas. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody looked alarmed. A 3-second interruption in a busy grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing. Barely noticeable. But I noticed something else. Through the store's front windows, in the parking lot, a flock of starlings had lifted off from the power lines. Hundreds of them, moving in a tight, swirling cloud, heading south, fast. And in the bed of a pickup truck parked near the entrance, a dog was losing its mind. Barking, spinning, clawing at the truck bed, trying to get out. Its owner came out of the store a minute later and tried to calm it down. The dog wouldn't stop barking. It strained against its leash, pulling south toward the road, away from the mountains. A 3-second pulse, in the middle of the day, in the middle of a city of 100,000 people. The nighttime events had been one thing, isolated, deniable. You could chalk them up to atmospheric anomalies, power grid fluctuations, personal health issues, but a pulse strong enough to interrupt electrical systems in a commercial building, in broad daylight, in a populated area, that was something different. That was the network testing a new boundary. And this time, the boundary was civilization itself. I drove home and called Nina. It happened in Portland, too, she said before I could speak. What? 12 minutes ago. A low-frequency pulse that disrupted electronics across a 6-block area on the east side. Cell service dropped. A traffic light malfunctioned. 3 people at a bus stop reported sudden nausea and 1 had a nosebleed. 12 minutes ago? That's when it happened in Bend. Simultaneous, 2 cities, 200 miles apart, same pulse. Simultaneous, across 200 miles. Because the network wasn't sending a signal from one location to another. It was everywhere at once. Every pulse was the whole organism, activating together, the way every neuron in a brain fires during a seizure. Nina, this is going to keep escalating. Whatever the network is doing, it's happening faster and reaching further. We need to go public. Go public with what? A correlation between cardiac deaths and a fungal network that we can't see, can't measure without specialized equipment, and that multiple federal agencies are actively suppressing. Who's going to publish that? The seismology data, your cardiac death cluster, Rena's veterinary records, the ELF readings. We have enough to establish a pattern. We have enough to establish a pattern that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Darren, I've spent 20 years in academic medicine. I know how this works. Without a mechanism, without reproducible controlled data, without institutional backing, we're just noise. They'll dismiss us as fringe researchers chasing a correlation. She was right. I knew she was right. Then we need the mechanism, I said. We need Price's data, the real data, the stuff that was classified. That data is in a government facility somewhere, behind a security clearance neither of us has. Not necessarily. Price installed sensor arrays in the old growth section. The arrays were removed, but the holes were still there when I visited in 2014. And the network was growing into those holes, actively growing into the spaces where the instruments had been. What if the network was trying to interface with the instruments? What if it wasn't just a passive subject of the study? Nina was quiet. What if the reason Price's data was so alarming wasn't just that the network showed signs of awareness, but that the network showed signs of trying to communicate? Communicate what? I don't know, but I know someone who might. I didn't want to go back to Cascade River. I want to make that absolutely clear. Every part of me that was still capable of rational self-preservation screamed against it. I thought about the deer lying in the ferns, eyes open, heart stopped, killed by something they could feel but not escape. I thought about Cal, about Doug, about Mark Solano. I thought about Whitfield telling me that exposure had long-term health consequences. I thought about my cortisol levels, my nosebleeds, the blood on my pillow every morning. But I also thought about the grocery store, the starlings, the dog in the truck, the 3-second pulse in the middle of a city. And I thought about what would happen when the pulses got longer, stronger, more frequent. When they started affecting not just animals and sensitive instruments, but people. Electrical grids, hospitals, highways. Nina's data showed the cardiac deaths were increasing. The intervals between major pulses were shortening. The geographic spread was widening. Whatever the network was building toward, whatever event the coherence spikes were precursors to it, was approaching. And nobody outside of a classified program that had already failed to contain it even understood what they were looking at. I needed Price's study sites, not the stripped, empty plots I'd found in 2014. The core zone, the place where Price had first measured those brainwave-like oscillations, the place where Mark Solano had died, the place where the network was densest, most active, most awake. If the network had been trying to interface with Price's instruments, the core zone would still bear the evidence. Mycelial growth is persistent. Whatever structures the network had built around those instruments would still be there, 12 years later, continuing to grow into the shapes of objects that no longer existed. I called Rena and told her what I was planning. She tried to talk me out of it. When that failed, she insisted on teaching me basic cardiac self-monitoring, how to check my pulse, how to recognize the early signs of arrhythmia, how to use the portable defibrillator she loaned me from her clinic. If your heart rate goes above 160, you leave immediately, she said. No exceptions. No 5 more minutes. You leave. I promised. Nina sent me updated ELF detection equipment, a newer model with data logging capability and a higher sensitivity range. She also sent something I hadn't asked for, a packet of earplugs designed for infrasound attenuation, military grade. She'd obtained them from a contact at OHSU's Occupational Health Division. They won't block everything, she told me on the phone, but they should reduce the infrasonic exposure by about 60%. It might be enough to prevent acute symptoms. Where did you get military-grade earplugs? A colleague who works with veterans experiencing blast-related hearing issues. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. I packed the truck on December 1st. I told my neighbor I was going on a camping trip. I loaded gear for 5 days: food, water, fuel, sleeping bag, the ELF detector, the defibrillator, a handheld GPS, a camera, sample bags, and a printout of every data point Nina and I had collected. I also brought something I'd purchased the week before, a handheld electromagnetic field meter capable of measuring AC and DC fields from 0 to 2,000 milligauss. I drove north, 5 hours through the Oregon high desert, over the Santiam Pass, into the wet side of the Cascades. The landscape changed as I descended from the pass, dry juniper giving way to Douglas fir, ponderosa giving way to hemlock. The air thickened, the sky lowered. By the time I crossed into Washington, it was raining. I reached Harmon at 4 p.m. The town looked the same: gas station, diner, post office. But the diner was closed. A handwritten sign in the window said, "Closed until further notice." The gas station was open but empty. No one at the counter. I pumped gas, left cash, and kept driving. Forest Road 2214, the road to my old station, was gated. A new gate, heavy steel, with a digital lock I couldn't cut. A sign read, "Road closed, Forest Restoration Project, no public access." Forest Restoration Project. The same kind of anodyne excuse they'd used for 20 years. I drove past and continued on Forest Road 2218. The gate to the old growth access road had also been updated, same digital lock, same closure sign. But I noticed something new. On either side of the gate, running into the forest in both directions, was a line of metal posts driven into the ground at approximately 50-foot intervals. Each post was topped with a small, weathered gray box about the size of a paperback book. They extended as far as I could see in both directions, disappearing into the trees. The suppression array, the perimeter, visible, physical infrastructure that hadn't been there in 2014. Whatever the containment program was, it had expanded significantly in the last 11 years. These weren't hidden sensors buried in the forest floor. These were permanent, industrial-grade installations, and some of them were dark. I got out of the truck and walked to the nearest post. The gray box on top had a small LED indicator on its face. It was off. I checked the next post. Also off. The third had a faint red light, blinking slowly. The fourth was off. I counted 12 posts visible from the road. 9 were dark. 3 showed red blinking lights. The array was running at about 25% capacity. The note from Station 7 had said 40% of the northern perimeter had failed as of 2022. It was worse now. Much worse. I drove around the gate by taking a decommissioned logging road that branched off 2218 about 2 miles south of the gate. The road was in terrible condition. Washouts, fallen trees, brush so thick it scraped both sides of the truck. But it connected to a ridgeline that I knew from my patrol days, and from the ridge I could descend into the drainage that led to the old-growth boundary on foot. I parked the truck at the end of the ridgeline road, just as the light was failing. I set up camp in the cab, eating cold food and watching the ELF detector. At 8 p.m. the display was flat. At 10 p.m., flat. At midnight, flat. At 1:47 a.m. the line jumped. The signal came on like a switch being thrown. 7.83 hertz, same as my kitchen in Bend, but the amplitude was staggering. The display maxed out its scale, and the device began emitting a soft warning tone it had never made before. I fumbled for the earplugs and shoved them in. The silence hit. Total. The rain, which had been drumming on the truck roof for hours, continued falling. I could see it on the windshield, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. The earplugs were in, but the silence went beyond what earplugs could explain. It was as if sound itself had been suppressed, as if the air had stopped carrying vibrations above a certain frequency, allowing only the deep, sub-audible pulse of the network to pass through. And then I felt the attention. It was stronger here, immensely stronger. In Bend, it had felt like a distant awareness, like being noticed by something far away. Here, a few miles from the old-growth section, it felt like being examined, like something vast was pressing against the inside of my skull, not painfully, but with a weight and presence that made my thoughts scatter like startled birds. I gripped the steering wheel and breathed. In, out, in, out. I checked my pulse. 112. High but not dangerous. I kept breathing. The attention shifted. I can't explain that any other way. It was like being in a dark room with someone holding a flashlight, and the beam moves away from you. The pressure in my head eased. The silence thinned. I could hear the rain again, faintly, as if from a great distance. I looked out the windshield. The forest was dark, the trees barely visible in the ambient glow of the clouds. But in the valley below the ridge, moving through the trees, I could see them. Lights. low to the ground. Not the steady yellowish lights Cal had described from his lookout. These were different, brighter, bluish. And they weren't moving in a straight line. They were converging. Dozens of them, coming from multiple directions, flowing toward a single point somewhere in the old growth section like tributaries joining a river. I watched for 20 minutes. The lights gathered, concentrated, became a single glow visible through the canopy. Then, over the course of about 30 seconds, the glow intensified to a point where the trees were silhouetted against it, like an inverted sunrise. And then it went dark. The silence lifted completely. The ELF detector dropped to baseline. The rain sounded normal. My pulse was 94 and falling. My nose was bleeding. The earplugs had helped, but not enough. In the morning, I descended the ridge. The forest was different. I'd spent 3 years patrolling this landscape. I knew every drainage, every game trail, every landmark. The physical geography was the same ridges, same creek, same river in the distance. But the forest itself was wrong. The undergrowth was too thick. The ferns were too green. The moss on the trees was dense in a way I'd never seen, not just covering the bark, but extending outward from it in thick, almost sculptural formations. The air was warm, much warmer than it should have been for December in the Cascades, and there was a smell, the same deep, organic, root-cellar smell I'd encountered in the old growth section 11 years ago, but stronger. I crossed the river at the same ford I'd used in 2014. The water level was lower than expected. On the far bank, the managed forest that should have bordered the old growth section was gone, not logged, consumed. The old growth had expanded, the ancient trees pushing outward, their canopy closing over what had been second-growth timber. Where the boundary had been clear in 2014, there was now a seamless expanse of ancient-looking forest that extended as far as I could see. The 100-meter-per-year estimate was wrong. The old growth had expanded by at least a mile in 11 years, and it wasn't just the trees. The entire ecosystem had shifted: the soil, the undergrowth, the canopy structure. Everything had been absorbed into the old growth system. I checked the EMF meter. It was showing a steady reading of 15 milligauss. Normal background is less than 1. The network was active, not pulsing, just on, humming at a constant low level like an idling engine. I walked northwest toward the core zone. Every step took me deeper into a forest that felt less like a forest and more like the interior of something. The canopy was so dense that the December morning was reduced to a permanent twilight. The trees were enormous, larger even than what I remembered, their trunks gnarled and massive, their root systems erupting from the soil in ridges that looked like tendons under skin. And the mycelium was everywhere, not hidden, not underground. It grew on the surface in thick white mats that covered the forest floor like snow. It climbed the trees in branching patterns that looked like veins. It stretched between trunks in suspended threads that caught the dim light and glowed faintly. The entire forest was webbed with it, connected, integrated, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic luminescence that was just barely visible. I checked my pulse. 105. I checked the ELF detector. The signal was steady, growing stronger as I walked. I kept going. About a mile in, I found the first suppression post. It was one of the perimeter array units, the same gray box on a metal post that I'd seen along the road. But this one was consumed. The mycelium had grown over it completely, encasing it in a thick cocoon of white filament. The metal post was still visible underneath, but the box was entirely absorbed. Whatever suppression signal it had been emitting, the network had simply grown around it and continued. I found 4 more posts in the next half mile, all consumed, all silent. The perimeter hadn't just failed, it had been enveloped. The network had treated the suppression array the way a tree treats a fence growing around it, absorbing it, making it part of itself. My EMF meter was reading 45 milligus. My pulse was 118. The earplugs were in, but I could still feel the vibration in my chest, steady and deep, like standing inside a cathedral organ. The pressure behind my eyes was building. I should have turned back. Rena's voice in my head: "If your heart rate goes above 160, you leave immediately." I wasn't there yet. I kept going, another half-mile. The forest opened into a clearing I recognized. It was Price's Plot 4, the site where Elena and I had felt the vibration, where her nose had bled, where the mycelium had pulsed like breathing. 11 years later, the clearing had transformed. The bare soil patch was still there, but it had expanded to nearly 30 feet in diameter. The surface was covered in mycelium so thick it looked like pale skin, smooth and undulating slightly with each pulse of the network. At the center of the patch, where the soil had been warm to the touch in 2014, something was growing. It rose from the ground like a stalagmite, roughly cylindrical, about 4 feet tall and 18 inches in diameter. It was made entirely of compacted mycelium white, dense, finely structured, with a surface texture that was almost ceramic. At the top, it flared into a shape that looked like a dish or a horn, angled slightly upward toward the canopy. I stared at it. It took me a long time to understand what I was looking at. It was a sensor. The network had grown a sensor. The shape matched roughly, imperfectly, but unmistakably the cylindrical instruments Price had pushed into the ground, the ones that had been removed, the ones the network had grown into the empty holes of, reaching toward objects that were no longer there. It had spent years trying to regrow what had been taken from it, not because the instruments were biologically useful, because the instruments were how it had communicated. Price hadn't just studied the network. He'd accidentally given it a voice. His sensor arrays had provided an interface, a way for the network's electrical signals to be translated into data that humans could read. And when the instruments were removed, the network had tried to rebuild them. From memory. From the impression left in the soil. The way a phantom limb still reaches for objects the hand can no longer hold. I was standing in front of a biological antenna, grown by a fungal network, shaped like human technology, pointed at the sky. And it was transmitting. The EMF meter was screaming. 200 milligus. 300. The needle pegged at the top of the scale. The ELF detector was recording a signal so strong that the waveform filled the entire display, a continuous oscillation at 7.83 Hz, with harmonic overtones at 14, 20, 26, 33 Hz, the full Schumann resonance series, every frequency, simultaneously. My pulse was 148. My nose was pouring blood. The pressure behind my eyes was blinding. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth, in my fingertips, in the soles of my feet. The vibration was so strong that the ground itself seemed to be humming, and the mycelium on the forest floor was pulsing visibly, contracting and expanding in waves that radiated outward from the central structure. I took 3 photos. My hands were shaking so badly that I don't know if any of them are usable. Then I heard something I've never been able to explain. It wasn't the hum. It wasn't the vibration. It was underneath the vibration, in the spaces between the pulses, like a pattern hidden inside white noise. A rhythm that was too complex to be mechanical but too regular to be random. It had a structure, a grammar. It repeated with variations the way a sentence repeats with different words. The network was speaking. Not to me, not to anything human. It was transmitting, the way a radio tower transmits broadcasting into the ground, into the rock, into the water table, into the mycelial web that stretched beneath 2 states. It was saying something to every part of itself, simultaneously, at the speed of electricity through living tissue. I don't know what it was saying. I'll never know. But standing there with blood running down my face and my heart trying to escape my chest, I understood something that Price must have understood, and Whitfield must have understood, and everyone who had ever stood in that clearing must have understood. This wasn't a phenomenon. It wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a threat to be contained or a curiosity to be studied. It was alive. It had been alive for thousands of years, growing in the dark, building complexity, layer by layer, root by root, until it became something that no word in any human language could describe. Not conscious the way we are, not intelligent the way we measure intelligence. Something else. Something that thinks with chemistry and electricity across a body the size of a mountain range. Something that experiences time in centuries and geography in hundreds of miles. Something that noticed us the way we notice weather as a temporary condition on its surface. And it was waking up. Not because of Price. Not because of the instruments or the containment or the suppression arrays. It was waking up because that's what it does. On its own timescale, in its own way, for its own reasons. We didn't cause this. We just happened to be standing on top of it when it opened its eyes. My pulse hit 157. I turned and ran. The animals were right. They were always right. When something ancient looks at you, you don't study it. You don't document it. You don't try to understand it. You run. I made it back to the river before my legs gave out. I fell on the bank and lay there in the mud, gasping, my heart hammering, the ELF detector still recording steadily in my pack. The vibration was fading. The pressure behind my eyes was easing. I could hear the river, the rain. A bird somewhere, the first bird I'd heard since crossing the boundary. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes. My pulse dropped to 130, then 115, then 100. The nosebleed stopped. I sat up, washed my face in the river, and looked back at the old growth section. The forest was silent. Not the wrong silence of the network's attention. Just the ordinary silence of a winter forest in the rain. Whatever I'd triggered, whatever had been happening in that clearing, it had stopped, or paused, or turned its attention elsewhere. I hiked back to the truck. It took 3 hours. I drove south without stopping, through Harmon, over the pass, back into the dry country, back to Bend. I didn't stop for gas. I didn't stop for food. I drove until I was in my driveway, and then I sat in the truck for 45 minutes, because I didn't trust my legs to carry me to the door. That night, I sent everything to Nina. The photos, the ELF readings, the EMF data, the GPS coordinates, and the observations. All of it. She called me back within an hour. Darren, the structure you photographed, the biological antenna. Yes. There's a paper, published last month in Nature by a team at the University of Exeter. The same group that published the computational paper I found earlier. They've documented for the first time spontaneous formation of organized mycelial structures in old-growth forests that serve no apparent biological function. They found 3 of them in a forest in Wales. Small ones, a few inches tall. They had no explanation. They called them anomalous emergent formations. Wales. Wales, on the other side of the world, in an old-growth forest. I didn't say anything. Darren, what if this isn't just the Pacific Northwest? What if every old-growth forest with an intact ancient mycorrhizal network is doing this? What if Cascade River was just the first place someone noticed because Price happened to put instruments in the right spot? I thought about the old-growth forests of the world. The Amazon, the Congo, the boreal forests of Siberia and Canada, the ancient woodlands of Europe and Asia. All of them connected historically through the same kinds of mycorrhizal networks, different species, different continents. But the same fundamental architecture, fungal filaments linking root systems, into vast, integrated webs that had been growing undisturbed for millennia. "The animals in Wales," I said. "Is there any data on animal behavior?" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." We talked for another hour. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the butcher paper map. The red dots, the dead, the pattern along the Cascades. I picked up a pen and drew a circle around Bend. Then I drew a line from Bend to Cascade River. Then I drew another line from Cascade River to Seattle, where Nina's seismologist had detected the vibrations. Then I drew lines to every point on the map, where we had data: the ranches, the Portland events, the grocery store in Bend. The lines didn't radiate from a center. They didn't form a pattern of expansion from a single point. They were scattered, random, like drops of rain on a window. Because the network wasn't expanding from Cascade River. It was everywhere. It had always been everywhere. The old growth section was just the loudest spot, the place where the signal was strongest, because that's where the ancient trees had kept the network intact and undisturbed long enough for it to reach whatever threshold turns a fungal network into something else. But wherever ancient forests still stood, wherever the network had been allowed to grow undisturbed for centuries, the same process was happening. The same coherence, the same awakening. The containment operation at Cascade River had been designed to suppress one hotspot, one node in a network that spanned a continent. It was like putting a muzzle on one head of a hydra. I put the pen down and stared at the map until my eyes burned. 3 weeks later, on December 22nd, the first human death occurred in Bend. A 41-year-old man named Thomas Dahl was found dead in his home by his wife. Cardiac arrest. No pre-existing conditions. No drugs, no alcohol, no explanation. He was healthy, active, a competitive cyclist. His home was on the north side of Bend, less than 2 miles from the Paulson Ranch. Rena called me that morning. She'd heard about it from a colleague at the hospital. "Darren, the EMT report mentions that when they arrived, every animal in the neighborhood was gone. No dogs, no cats, no birds." The wife said she woke up at around 2 a.m. because the dog was howling. She let the dog out and it ran. She went back to bed and found her husband unresponsive. The dog ran. The dog knew. The dog did what every animal does when the network pulses. Thomas Dahl stayed in bed. Because he was human. Because humans don't run from things they can't see. I called Nina. "I know," she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "It's starting. The same thing that happened at Cascade River is happening in Bend, and Portland, and Seattle, and everywhere else the network is active. What do we do?" "I'm meeting with someone tomorrow, a journalist at Oregon Public Broadcasting. I've decided to go public. I know the risks. I know it sounds like conspiracy theory, but people are dying and nobody is doing anything." "Nina, I know what you're going to say. Whitfield, the classification, the consequences. Darren, I don't care anymore. A 41-year-old man is dead. How many more before we say something?" I didn't argue with her. She was right. The interview aired on December 28th. It was careful, measured, responsible. Nina presented the cardiac death cluster data, the geographic correlation, and the ELF readings without mentioning the classified containment program or the DoD connection. She framed it as an unexplained public health phenomenon that warranted investigation. She was calm, professional, credible. The story ran for about 7 minutes. It was picked up by 2 regional papers and a science blog. A few comments online. A few shares. Then, nothing. It sank beneath the daily noise of politics and weather and sports within 48 hours. Nobody cared. Or rather, nobody noticed. Because the story sounded small, a doctor with an unusual theory about cardiac deaths and underground fungi. It sounded like fringe science. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing you'd scroll past on your way to something more interesting. That's the thing about slow catastrophes. They don't look like emergencies. They look like statistics. On January 3rd, the second human death occurred. A 67-year-old retired teacher in Portland. Same profile. Cardiac arrest. Healthy. No explanation. Home was near Forest Park, one of the largest urban forests in the country. Old growth. Intact mycorrhizal systems. On January 9th, the 3rd, a 29-year-old graduate student in Seattle, found dead in her apartment near the University Arboretum. Cardiac arrest. She'd been perfectly healthy. On January 14th, Nina Reeves didn't answer her phone. I called her home number. No answer. I called OHSU and asked for her office. The receptionist told me Dr. Reeves was on indefinite leave and couldn't be reached. I drove to Portland the next day. Her office at OHSU was locked. Her nameplate was still on the door. A colleague I found in the hallway told me Nina had been placed on administrative leave pending a review of research conduct. He didn't know the details. He said federal investigators had visited the department. I went to her apartment in Northeast Portland. She wasn't there. A neighbor said she'd seen Nina leave 2 days ago with a suitcase. She'd looked frightened. I never found Nina Reeves. I went home. I sat in my kitchen. The ELF detector was spiking every night now. My nosebleeds were daily. My cortisol levels, when I had them rechecked, were double what they'd been 2 months earlier. And the animals in my neighborhood were leaving. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But I noticed the birds thinning out. The squirrels disappearing. The stray cats that used to patrol the alley behind my house. Gone. The deer that had been appearing in my yard every night at 2:17. They stopped coming. Not because the pulses stopped. Because the deer had left the area entirely. They'd done what deer do. They'd run, and they hadn't come back. The animals were evacuating Bend. Quietly, individually, without coordination or announcement, following an instinct older than language, older than thought, older than anything humans had built or imagined. An instinct that said, "The ground is wrong here. Move." I'm recording this in my truck. I'm parked at a rest stop on Interstate 5, somewhere south of Eugene. Everything I own is in the bed. I left Bend 3 days ago. I'm driving south. I don't know where I'm going. Somewhere without old-growth forest. Somewhere without mountains. Somewhere the soil is young and thin and the roots don't go deep. Maybe the desert. Maybe the coast. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the network is everywhere and there's nowhere left to go. But I keep thinking about the elk. That first morning on the ridge, October 14th, 2014. 30 animals, all turning at the same instant, all running southeast. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wonder what was happening. They didn't need to understand. They felt the ground change beneath them and they moved, together, immediately, completely. They're still alive. I'm sure of it. Somewhere out there, those elk are grazing in a meadow that feels right, where the soil is quiet and the network hasn't reached or hasn't woken up. They survived because they listened to the oldest alarm in the world, and they obeyed it without question. I didn't listen. Not in 2014, when every animal in the forest was telling me to leave. Not in Bend, when the deer ran through my yard every night and I stayed in bed with a nosebleed taking notes. I investigated. I documented. I tried to understand. And now I'm driving south with blood on my pillow and a heart that skips every third beat. And I still don't fully understand what's beneath us. And I'm starting to think that not understanding is the point. That the human need to understand, to study, to explain, to contain, is the thing that makes us vulnerable. Because you can't run from something while you're trying to comprehend it. You can't escape something while you're leaning in to get a better look. The animals don't lean in. The animals don't need to know why. They just feel the wrongness, and they go. I should have gone with them. 11 years ago. The moment I watched those elk run, I should have put down the binoculars, gotten in my truck, and driven south until the mountains disappeared behind me. That was the signal. That was the warning. Everything that came after the dead deer, the missing cameras, the containment program, Elena, Whitfield, Nina, all of it was me refusing to hear what the forest was screaming in the only language it knows. Run. I'm running now. Late, damaged. Maybe too late. My heart does something at night that hearts shouldn't do. A flutter that feels like a hand closing around it and then letting go. The nosebleeds happen even during the day now. And sometimes, on the highway in broad daylight, I feel it, that attention, that vast, slow awareness turning toward me like a searchlight sweeping a field. It knows me. I spent too long inside it, too close to it, breathing its air, standing on its skin. It knows me the way the ground knows rain. And I don't think distance matters to something that thinks in hundreds of miles. But I'm still going. South. Toward flatland. Toward young soil. Toward places where the trees are short and the roots are shallow and the oldest thing in the ground is last year's grass. I don't know if it will help, but the animals are going too. I see them on the highway sometimes, deer crossing the road in groups, moving south. Elk in the median. Coyotes loping along the shoulder in broad daylight. Not hunting, just traveling. Going somewhere. Away. When the animals run, we should run too. I spent 11 years learning that lesson. I hope you learn it faster than I did.